to another serious topic, and that is some proposed amendments to our state legislative agenda regarding firearms. So I'll make sure that we can take a moment to get settled here and invite Ms. Lesh up for presentation. And I'll note also that we have been joined by our Assistant Chief of Police, and thank you very much for being here as well, Ms. Lesh.
Good morning, Madam Chair and council members. I'm here today to talk about some proposed ideas for amendment to both the city's state and federal legislative agenda as they pertain to firearms. And this has come to our attention that we really wanted to highlight these items. We know this is a significant issue in our community and federally, and so we really wanted to take a look at how we were addressing the issue in our legislative agenda and highlight it more and organize it in a way that really showed its importance both to the elected leadership of the city as well as the residents of the city of Minneapolis. So just by way of quick review, we currently have 3 items in our current legislative agenda having to do with firearms, but they were scattered in different parts of the public safety section of the legislative agenda. We had an item having to do with blood alcohol concentration and possession of a firearm. We had an item having to do with the mandatory reporting, a very large item, legislation supporting significant gun control measures, including the mandatory reporting of any lost or stolen firearm, strengthening laws regulating the transfer of firearms, the prohibition of possessing replica guns in public, and measures to stop the flow of handguns to youth. So a very broad item that really has previously allowed us the flexibility to respond to firearms-related legislation at the state capitol, but maybe didn't reflect in specificity the real detailed policies that are the priorities of the city. And then finally, legislation disqualifying an offender who violates a domestic abuse no-contact order or interferes with an emergency call from owning or possessing a pistol. That was in the public safety section, but within the domestic abuse subsection of the public safety section. So we wanted to take these scattered items and create one unified reducing gun violence section in the public safety section of the agenda. So that's what you have before you today. Just a little bit on the background on the process that we went through to bring these items to you. As always, the city tries to partner with members of the community, our partners in other local jurisdictions, and in law enforcement. So in bringing this list to you today, just a brief list of the organizations and the groups that I met with and spoke with to compile this list. Of course, our own city attorney's office and police department, various city council offices, so thank you for your input and feedback in this process, and our partners such as other cities, Protect Minnesota, and the Minnesota Chiefs of Police Association Legislative Committee. So in discussions with those organizations, we have taken their input and their suggestions, and that's where you have the list in front of you today. So I'll briefly review some of these items if you wish, Madam Chair, and then I would also ask Assistant Chief Clark to come for some follow-up and some detail for these items if that's helpful. So what we have suggested before you today is to shift existing items into new categories, to move the item having to do with blood concentration, from currently, it's describing blood alcohol concentration, but we'd like that to be a little bit broader and talk about carrying a handgun under the influence in general, not simply alcohol. But that will be encompassed into a new item. The broad statement encompassing lots of policies, the item number 2, we suggest that could be a nice introductory statement. I could tweak that and have that be more of an overarching statement for the section. And then finally, the item having to do with violating a no-contact order, that would be moved from the domestic abuse section in general and moved to a priority item within the new reducing gun violence section. Then moving forward for the new items in the agenda from our discussions with our partners, we've suggested 5 new items for the priority section. Number 1 is to amend the Minnesota statute requiring the permit to carry in public to an actual conceal and carry. Currently, that's simply a permit to carry. Number 2, create a gross misdemeanor offense for carrying a firearm while under the influence. Currently, that offense is a misdemeanor. Number 3, reduce access to firearms and revoke firearm permits for those who experienced a mental health incident that's required the intervention of law enforcement, such as a 72-hour hold. Currently, we really only have authority to withhold a permit or a firearm if a person has been adjudicated as having a mental health limitation that should prohibit them from carrying a firearm. And I believe Assistant Chief Clark can talk a little bit more about the process, what happens at the end of a 72-hour hold, how we would like to have a little bit more ability to evaluate someone to determine if they are prepared to retain their permit and their firearm. Number 4 is a really interesting case, actually, that came out of Ramsey County in 2012 that has created some challenges for local law enforcement when it comes to carrying a pistol in a public place. And what the court found in that decision is that carrying a pistol without a permit in a private yard, so the front lawn of a home, is not carrying a pistol in public, even when the person is not the owner of the property and was not invited by the owner. So the scenario in this case would be a person possessing a pistol in one of our neighborhoods could literally hop from yard to yard because according to this decision, that is private property, and law enforcement does not have the ability to approach that person to determine, are you the owner of this property and do you possess a permit to carry? So I believe Assistant Chief Clark will give a little bit more background on that and why that is a significant priority both for the City Attorney's Office and for the Police Department. And finally, the 5th item that we would suggest for the priority section is an amendment to state law that preempts the ability of local jurisdictions to implement firearms safety ordinances appropriate to that community. We have some new language that we're going to be using to tighten that up. Thanks to Councilmember Gordon for suggesting that. It was law until 1985 that cities of the first class had the authority to have local ordinances that were more restrictive than state law. That was repealed in 1985 for all cities, including cities of the first class. So in working with our friends at Protect Minnesota, they also have an item on their legislative agenda addressing this and giving more creativity and flexibility to local authorities when it comes to our own ordinances. And then finally, we've suggested a support section for reducing gun violence. Item number 1, prohibit those convicted of actual or attempted domestic abuse by strangulation from possessing a firearm. That is a seriously important issue and has been brought to our attention by the City Attorney's Office. The only reason it's in the support section is that it's being led at the state capitol by the Minnesota County Attorneys Association. So since they will be championing that with our support, we have put that in the support section. Item number 2, increase discretionary power for municipalities to grant or deny firearm permits. And again, I look to Assistant Chief Clark to add more detail into this. There are very specific limitations in statute that give guidance and control over local jurisdictions and local law enforcement for when we may deny or approve firearms permits. And there's a lot of gray area. So we would like a little bit more clarity and discretion over that process. Item number 3, creation of a legislatively mandated multidisciplinary gun violence policy committee to look in depth at Minnesota's gun laws and make recommendations to the legislature. We do believe this is a significant issue as well, that this would be a good path for our legislature to take, so we would support the creation of such a panel. And finally, requiring the reporting of lost or stolen firearms, as we know that is often a reason given as to why firearms end up where they were not originally intended. I lost it, it was stolen. We believe that should be reported.
I think why don't we take questions and have discussion on these proposed state items before we turn to the federal items. I think the federal items are more general and have been a bit more public for at least a period of time. I am certain there will be specific questions on these items, and I am going to ask my colleagues, can we perhaps take these one by one? Because I think there may be questions of some type and probably a need for a little bit more presentation. Certainly on the priority items to start off, just so we kind of keep some order to how we're going through. I might invite our Assistant Chief up to start a little bit more discussion on item number 1 in particular. I will say this one, this is one where already I think several colleagues of here, and including myself, are receiving a lot of comments on this one already, really from almost both sides of the fence. So on the one side, I think we are hearing comments from individuals that disagree with the carry law in the first place, and so question why should we spend what will be a lot of public energy on amending that to make it conceal and carry. And also I think there's some differences of opinion on conceal and carry versus carry, what is a better policy, and so we want to hear from you on that. On the other side of the fence, I know that many of us are hearing from individuals who are concerned about their Second Amendment rights and bring up some various issues, including what's the practicality of doing conceal, depending on what you're wearing and things like that. So can you tell us a little bit more about why this is on the agenda, why it appears as item number 1, Assistant Chief?
Will do. Thank you. Good morning, council members. I would like to say to start off with, and speaking for Chief Arto, we do support these legislative proposals as a police department. We're looking for multiple strategies to reduce gun violence and to improve public safety. And these are not the only strategies we have. Obviously, there are a number of other items that we're going to work on, and related to the gun summit, related to working with the Minnesota Chiefs Association on what is best for not only Minneapolis but the state. And specifically on amendment number 1 that's listed on the priorities, what we're looking for is that if you have a permit to carry a firearm that is concealed in public. We have a lot of calls from constituents, individuals, residents, visitors that are very shocked and surprised to see a handgun on somebody out in the open. And we know as law enforcement officers, when we carry off duty, we carry concealed. That's part of our policy. Whether you're male or female, there's a number of different versions of handguns out there. And for the most part, we know that we're able to carry that firearm off duty, keep it concealed, and still, if we need to, protect the public off duty.
Okay, so here's a little bit of my question here, and I'm asking again because this appears so high on your agenda. Is there something about whether it's conceal versus just carry that makes it a public safety issue? I mean, I've heard that you're getting a lot of calls that people are concerned with what they can see. And so what makes the translation to this as helping promote public safety? Well,
we've had incidents where handgun owners have had their guns taken away from them, where they have lost those firearms because somebody knew that they had them on their person, and they specifically took it away from those individuals. I think you're inviting additional issues when you have a gun that is exposed to the public. We're not saying that on private property that you couldn't do that, but what we're saying in this priority is that if you have a handgun and you're out in public, for the most part, it doesn't need to be exposed, it doesn't cause alarm to the public, and it doesn't openly invite others to take that firearm away from you.
And Councilmember Tuthill has a question. I have just one last follow-up. Is this a position of the state chiefs of police, or is it a, well, anyway, I just wanted to know kind of who has this on their agenda, and again, that kind of goes to why also would we have this as a priority item for us if others have it on their agenda?
Council members, I specifically discussed this with the legislative committee for the Minnesota Chiefs Association. This one item was brought up to them, and it's in discussion at this point. Okay. Chief Ramsey, who heads the committee, and I discussed the point, and I think they are in favor of that, but again, they're discussing that with their group.
They haven't yet formally adopted.
Yes, that's correct.
Is maybe the point. Okay. Councilmember Tuthill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I appreciate you being here, Chief Clark. From a personal standpoint and former small business owner, I will tell you the minute someone hit my door and I saw a gun, I dialed 911. I've had a gun cocked at my head on 4 different occasions when I owned a business. It's extremely frightening to me. I have no way of knowing whether I am behind a counter, waiting a table, ringing up someone's gas purchase. I have no idea whether or not they have a permit to carry that gun. And as a former small business owner, I don't care that we have videotapes in our store. It's too late once they cock that gun. I've had 2 of my children that have had guns cocked at their head in our business. I'm really concerned about that. And so if I see a gun, my immediate reaction is to dial 911. No one's wearing that permit on their chest that I know that it's legal for them to have the gun. At one time in one of our businesses, someone walked in with a sawed-off shotgun rolled in a newspaper. It's pretty frightening, and until you've been at the other end of a gun cocked at your head, you have no idea what kind of fear this is. So as a protection for those of us who don't carry or are going about our daily business, seeing a gun to me says call 911, and they can check it out and see whether or not the person has a permit to carry. So consequently, if I didn't see it, I wouldn't call 911 because I wouldn't worry as much. So this concerns me immensely because I think for a lot of us that go about normal everyday businesses that have chosen not to carry a gun, I think that it's important that we know we don't see it. If we see it, then we know absolutely we need to dial 911. Just my comments.
Okay, other questions on this point? And let's turn then to item number 2, create a gross misdemeanor offense for carrying a firearm while under the influence. Is this an item that the chiefs of police are formally supporting?
Again, Madam Chair, we discussed that specifically at our legislative committee meeting. They haven't come out with a specific support of that item.
Okay. And is there a reason that this doesn't, and I'm just asking, is there a reason that this just generally mentions under the influence as opposed to a certain blood content level?
I believe there's some specifics there. When you look at the DWI laws for the state, there is a implied consent process that you go through to determine blood alcohol level or level of under the influence when it relates to drugs. And that whole process can somewhat be adopted into looking at firearms and carrying of firearms under a permit. That state process is pretty clear on if you meet a certain threshold and you're impaired, and that's the key word, impaired, then your abilities to reason and to use that firearm or drive a vehicle is limited. And I think that what's key is that people who possess a firearm with that permit, and if they are impaired, they wouldn't have the two mixing. They shouldn't have a gun and they shouldn't be impaired at the same time.
Okay. Ms. Lush?
And thank you, Madam Chair. If I could also just add briefly that currently the blood alcohol content level permitted by law to carry a firearm is 0.10. And we know that to operate a vehicle, it's 0.08. So let's let that sink in for a moment. And then one other point that I wanted to raise that Assistant Chief Clark brought to my attention earlier that I also found really interesting is that in our hunting laws, the taking of an animal while under the influence, again with that 0.10 level, is currently a gross misdemeanor. And just driving is a misdemeanor. Having a firearm while under the influence in general is a misdemeanor, but hunting is a gross misdemeanor. So a little conflict in our even existing statute at the time.
Okay, so in part, this may be to kind of create some consistency. Is that part of the?
I don't believe that the 0.10, Madam Chair, is in there accidentally. I think that there were probably some negotiations that happened when some of these decisions were made around the discussions of conceal and carry, and when the 0.08 was created. I think there were some discussions at the time that it's just not an accident that this remained at 0.10. So.
Okay. And Council President Johnson, did you have a? It was answered. Okay. All right. I'm not seeing any further questions. Item number 3. Did you?
That's a difficult situation with mental health issues. We always want to support people that are going through a mental health situation or episode, but we also want to consider what is the best course of action for the public? Is it limiting their possession of a firearm temporarily? That's a difficult situation that I think is best left in the hands of some of our social service providers and some of the experts in mental health. One of the things that I would kind of point out is when we do a 72-hour hold for an individual, what we're asking is that somebody in the mental health field do an assessment of this individual because they've acted in a way that threatens their safety or the safety of others, such as said they were going to commit suicide, said they may harm somebody, and we know that they're going through a mental health episode. So that's our referral for how we want to deal with those individuals. The difficult part is, if they have a firearm at the time, what do we do with that? Do we hold on to that, and then do we release that firearm to them, even though we don't have a sign-off from a mental health expert that says this person's okay to have this firearm in public? And so I think those are some of the questions we're looking to you and the legislature to answer. How do we resolve the situation?
Council President Johnson.
Thank you, Madam Chair, and Assistant Chief Clark. When someone is brought, and I did this so long ago that procedures are probably different now, but I mean, our police officers transport people probably still to the Crisis Intervention Center at HCMC, do they at times? Then does the police officer request the 72-hour hold, or does the crisis center, who makes that decision that someone is placed on a 72-hour hold?
Council President, by law, we can sign a 72-hour hold, the police
Okay.
officer can, ensuring that somebody from a mental health
Then they have to have an
facility
examination
will
and
look
so
at
on,
that
in
individual.
that time frame, and, okay.
That's correct.
Okay, so, so our folks would make the determination that that person shouldn't go back home without seeing a mental health professional in that time.
Yes, Council
Okay.
President, we would do that. We would
Okay.
make that recommendation based on solely if they're a threat to themselves or others.
Yep. And that's a really high standard. So, yeah, okay, thank you.
Councilmember Hofstad.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In the example that President Johnson used, if our facilities are full and the person is definitely needs help, then what is the protocol?
Well, Council Member, we have had incidents where individuals have gone on to mental health episodes, and they have either their doctors, social service providers, or others who have a connection to them. And through our crisis intervention training, our officers know that they want to contact those individuals, connect them immediately so they can get some emergency help, and then we do bring them to crisis. We haven't had an incident where crisis has said, we won't take that individual, we're full. We haven't had incidences where that mental health expert doesn't give an assessment before they release that person. And sometimes it's just a matter of 3 to 4 hours. After the assessment by the mental health expert, that person's released based on possibly a follow-up visit, medication, whatever that resource might be. But again, if there's a firearm involved in that, what is our job as law enforcement? How do we deal with that situation? And I'll give you an example. We had one person going through a mental health episode who had a number of firearms in doorways and windows in their home. And this veteran was a decent person, but they were just going through one of those episodes of post-traumatic stress. When we deal with that individual and we put them into a situation where they're receiving help, what do we do with those firearms? And how do we release those? And that's kind of a question that we're looking for from the council and from the state legislator.
Thank you. I think you bring up a multitude of issues. One, certainly regarding, people who are having these kinds of weapons and having episodes, but also the nature of the policing that we have today. It's much more complex than a number of years ago with a number of complex issues. So, thank you.
Councilmember Quincy.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I had a Question about, and it's maybe for Ms. Lesh, but are we anticipating anybody sponsoring these in both houses? And are they members of the Minneapolis delegations?
Madam Chair and Councilmember Quincy, I'm currently in the process of talking to Protect Minnesota about who they have been working with. We want to usually line up our authors, and there's always the opportunity for combining policies into larger bills. I do anticipate some type of a firearms omnibus bill that might include a whole bunch of these types of ideas. So we're still very early, and all those parts are still moving. We know we do have interest from the Minneapolis delegation on several of these items, and we're currently in the process of bringing them to them and having face-to-face meetings with them and talking with them about what we are interested in pursuing. We wanted to wait until this was officially approved by the City Council before we really move forward on anything formal and introducing legislation and things like that. But if you have any feedback about, that you might be hearing from your legislators in particular, please let us know.
Yeah, I will do that. As a follow-up, I know this is still early in the process and moving parts. Are you aware of any efforts to introduce a repeal the carry law in general?
Madam Chair and Councilmember, I'm not at this point in time aware of any attempt to, a full repeal of the carry law. As you all know, these issues are very complex and very bipartisan on both sides. Minnesota has a long and proud history of outdoorsmanship and hunting and things of that nature, and so these issues tend to cut across party lines. So we'll just have to, kind of wait and see where some of the chips fall on some of these issues.
Councilmember Todd Hill.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I just wanted to mention, as long as Councilmember Quincy had brought up about the authoring, I sit on the CJCC, which is the Criminal Justice Coordinating Committee, with our city attorney and Councilmember Samuels, and these same issues were being discussed this morning at great length, and a number of them we have laid over a month for further discussion. And of course, for those of folks in our audience that don't know, that includes county and city people, police chiefs, Hennepin County Sheriff, Hennepin County Attorney, judges. So it's a real swath of folks from different backgrounds that sit on that committee, and the discussion's quite lively. So they're pretty much in tune with what the city's looking at right now, but we're going to continue our discussions for